Hi everyone, welcome to Virtual Empower 2020. I'm here to present a session on optimizing your application's performance and scale. My name is David McCormick. I manage a team of customer success managers here at QuickBase, and I've been here for 15 years, been working with our customers for a long time, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about app performance and scalability. I'm going to break down our talk today into a few different sections. We're going to talk about basics of QuickBase, a little bit about our performance to date, just so you have an understanding of how QuickBase works. We'll touch on the architecture of QuickBase. Then I'm going to focus pretty heavily on how to get the most speed and scalability out of your QuickBase applications. We'll start with the basics. A couple of little quick facts for you. We'll talk about, again, the state of performance and some architecture basics. So, state of performance. How is QuickBase doing? QuickBase, as its name implies, is incredibly fast. Just a couple of key statistics to call out on this slide is we do about over 1 billion requests every month are processed through the QuickBase platform, which is tremendous. We do about 720 million API requests a month, and 40,000 applications are accessed every single day on the platform. And you can see the way that our platform has been scaling and how the activity on the platform has been growing over the years. It's very impressive. I've been working really hard behind the scenes to continue to improve the platform so that it continues to deliver top-notch performance for all of our customers. Speaking of that, the median response time for every request, every click that you make in the platform is about 21 milliseconds, which is 21 thousandths of a second, which is really fast. And so that's the median response rate for all clicks on all 40,000 apps every single month. So again, QuickBase is pretty fast. 99% of all those requests are returned in less than 2 seconds total, right? And so the amount of time it takes between a user clicking on something in QuickBase, 99% of all traffic on the platform is returned in less than 2 seconds. Again, which is really impressive, and we're really proud of that. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the architecture basics, just so you have a sense of how QuickBase is structured. We'll go through some of the key features of a QuickBase application. We're starting with the core of the QuickBase engine, if you will. QuickBase is a proprietary database. It is an in-memory database. It's written in C++ and running on bare metal machines. QuickBase is ours. It's not built on any other database technology or platform. On top of that, we layer in forms, fields, reports, analytics, that really bring your applications to life. And then we even layer on top of that automations, visual builders, a lot of other extra utilities that we again continue to layer on top of this core engine of QuickBase. And then finally, we've introduced a number of ways to do integrations with QuickBase, specifically pipelines, which is something really big this year that we're super proud of. So all these elements work together to deliver a really robust, really fast platform for our customers to use to build their applications. So that's just a quick review of of a little bit of our architecture and a little bit of the state of performance today. There's more sessions that you can take a look at in this year's Empower to really get a better understanding of QuickBase under the hood and really the infrastructure and the guts of QuickBase. But I'm going to focus today on speed and scalability. So when it comes to speed, there's really 3 things that I think are really important to zero in on when you're tuning and optimizing your applications for speed. The first thing I'll talk about is roles and permissions. Roles and permissions are really important. They're one of the most important things you should consider when you're considering speed in your QuickBase applications. Every single request that any user makes in your applications requires a permissions check against their roles. And so every single thing that everybody does has to be checked against the permissions. And you can build your permissions, and you can build custom permissions, and you can build them in such a way that QuickBase has to do a lot of work just to figure out if this user can make that click that they're about to make. So when you're building those permissions, especially those custom permissions, we really think you should think about a couple of quick tips, right? And those permissions are built actually a lot like your report filters. If you're building a QuickBase report, they are a series of things that must be true, and then we go from one to the next to the next. So when you're building custom permissions, it's like you're building a report and you're saying, well, if this is true and this is true and this is true, the user can see that record or modify that record. So when you're layering on those custom filters or permissions, we suggest that you use scalar data before you use formulas, before you use summaries, and before you use lookups. The point and the reason for that is when we do those evaluations, we literally run through them from top to bottom. And so the first one should essentially eliminate the most records, and it should be data that's living right here in this table that we can access very quickly. We don't have to go do summaries and calculations on stuff that's living elsewhere in the application in other tables. And so the real whole nuts and bolts about permissions is just use data that's in the table that you're checking permissions against, and try to eliminate kind of the most records first with your first permissions. We'll get into more of that later. In fact, we'll get more of that right here in the filters, searches, and API sections. So as I alluded to with permissions, filters are another really, really important part of how to get the most performance out of your QuickBase applications. Again, if you're building a report in QuickBase and you want to narrow down the records in a data table to just a certain set of data that's important to you, you're going to have to apply some filters. A lot of times you'll have more than one filter that you have to apply just to get the right set of data. We apply those filters and start looking from top to bottom. And once we find the records in the first filter, then we'll go down and further narrow it down with each subsequent filter. So your first filters should eliminate the most records possible for consideration, right? When you are doing filters and you are layering them on, you should always use, if you're using operators like this text field has a value in it, we would definitely recommend you use the is operator instead of the contains whenever possible. The contains operator just means we've got to go looking all over the place through all the text just to see if it might contain that string, versus is, we're going to see if the contents of that cell has that thing or not, and then we're going to move on, right? So is a lot faster than contains. And again, using scalar data versus derived fields, those words kind of don't always mean everything to everybody. Scalar data is data that you typed into that table, into those fields, versus derived fields, which are formula fields, summary fields that might be counting data from another related table. So derived fields kind of come from somewhere else and we have to calculate it, versus scalar data, which is just stuff that's been typed into data fields, right? So always start with and use scalar fields before you use those derived fields in your many filters in your reports. And then just be aware that sorting and grouping and how many columns you have on a report, all of that has to be rendered on your users' browsers. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. More often than not, when we're talking to customers about performance issues or concerns, we can show them that QuickBase has already delivered their data for their report that they asked for in milliseconds. It's just that the user's screen is literally taking time to build all that data and build up the report that the way that they defined it, right? So just be conscious that every little bit that you add in terms of how many columns on the report, how many sorting you have, or how many groupings you have, all that just adds a little bit of time on your user's end, and they might see that as a slowdown. So just think about that. Here's a little look at a set of filters in a report where the number one filter I'm choosing is assigned to the current user. And so I'm going to basically eliminate everything that's not assigned to me first. And then it's going to go through the subsequent filters to evaluate those other conditions. And so it's operating on a much smaller set of data, and it can move a lot faster as it goes down the list. I'm going to also talk a little bit about searches here, because searches are another really common way to get a lot of, to do some optimization to get much better performance. Searches, and there's a couple of different kinds. There's like a global search in the product, which is a little magnifying glass in the upper right of every page. That is essentially some field contains something in any of the data tables in the app. So it's like the broadest, most casual search one could possibly do. And then each table has its own little searching capability. So when you're thinking about how your users are going to use your apps, think about how they might be searching for data. One of the things we always like to recommend to people is if you find that people are using those find searches, that magnifying glass on the top right a lot, you can actually disable it if you'd like to just turn it off and give people much better reports. Ask the user reports, for instance, put them on their dashboards where they can just type in the stuff that they're always looking for. And that report is designed to zero in on just those fields that just have that data. And those searches will go much, much, much faster. So it's really helpful to understand how your users are using the app and what their behavior is when they're searching, so that you can really custom fit an experience for them that is actually very performant. And there's another thing we talk about, I'll show you in a second here, which is making fields not searchable. And you might say, well, why not? Well, QuickBase defaults to making every field in a data table searchable by those kinds of find and global search options. Why? Because we want you to be able to find anything you're looking for, and we're just really trying to help get you the data that you need as fast as possible. The reality is a lot of the fields in your data tables don't actually have data in them that people would actually be looking for, right? Sometimes you have these URL fields, or you have these numeric fields. And how often is someone going to look for the number 4 or 4,000 or 40,000? And what are they expecting to get back when they do search for that? So you can usually predict which fields have the data that people are going to be looking for, and you can make those searchable and turn everything off. What you're seeing here on screen is a field listing from a data table. And in the upper right of those field lists, there's a little advanced options link. If you click that, you can have all these additional data fields that you can show in your field list. One of them is called searchable. If you put that in here, you get these little green checkbox. You can uncheck any of those fields that you don't want to be searchable by these global searches. And I promise you that will definitely improve your performance of your application. Another thing we talked about is disabling that search. You can go into role settings, and you can look at the user interface tab for any given role, and you can go table by table and actually disable the search UIs for those tables. Again, forcing kind of users into a more defined and predictable search pattern using the reports you've already built for them. Lastly, in this section, I'm just going to talk about using the API. The API, as you know, is another way to interact with QuickBase. That's not the user interface, but it's computers talking to computers. A lot of times people write scripts to use the API to pull data in and out of QuickBase. A lot of times when they're pulling data out of QuickBase, they're essentially running reports. They're running queries. And so the same tips that we have above for running filters and building reports are applicable for when you're building queries using the API. Use scalar data first, avoid contains, use is as often as possible, and put scalar data before you use derived data in your string of filters in a query. When you are doing long ads or long, big queries, try batching the jobs with your script using the API. If you know you're going to be pulling back thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of records at a time and things are going slow, consider chunking those up into batches and doing those serially. And then, of course, timing is critical. Try not to do those big API automated jobs in the middle of the day when your users are going to be very, very busy in the apps on the user interface. Try and schedule your API work on a time when people aren't necessarily in the app. And then lastly, monitor your scripts. That's one thing that a lot of developers in QuickBase don't think about all the time, is to actually build monitoring into the scripts that they write using our API, so that they're aware if there's an error, that they're monitoring kind of the speed of that things are returned, and that they can use that knowledge to come back and make optimizations inside of QuickBase and inside of their scripts, rather, to make things run faster. So that's, and lastly, in the speed category, we're going to talk about dashboards and notifications. Dashboards, super common activity that every single person does in an application. The first place you land is the dashboard, and it's the home page. It's where a lot of people go when they get lost in an application. It's a lot of people build those dashboards to be the place where people start their work every single day, and they always come back to those places. So very popular pages, and you can have lots and lots of reports on a dashboard. Well, those tips and tricks that I talked about earlier about reports and building optimized filters applies here, only it's multiplied, right? Because you have many reports, and it's happening all day long. So that's just more ammunition to think about the optimization of your report filters so that they're working as fast as they possibly can, especially the ones that you're putting on dashboards that people are going to hit all the time. Think about how many reports is the optimum number for any given dashboard. Sometimes people just put as many reports on there as they can because they think, why not? It's available to me. Just make deliberate choices about which reports you put on there and why, and for which users in which roles. A lot of people use images like red, yellow, green stoplight icons and things like that. Depending on where you're hosting that image, you're hosting that image in QuickBase, typically, every single one of those images needs to be checked with a permission. So be conscious of the permissions you have on an images table, for instance, that you're using elsewhere in the apps, because every single time we show one of those images, we've got to do a permission check on it. And yeah, some people do custom work on their dashboards, and they insert their own JavaScript in their dashboard pages and things like that. Just be conscious again of how much might be going on a given dashboard, because they're very popular pages. Here's a dashboard. And again, the question here is every single one of these reports optimized for the people who are going to be using them and viewing that particular dashboard? I'd recommend going into each one of those and checking out the filters and seeing if they're in the right order, whether you're eliminating the most possible records first, you're using scalar data versus derived data, etc. Lastly, we'll talk here about notifications, okay? Again, they're just like reports. There's kind of like a theme here. So when you're building notifications, use the same kinds of tips, right? And I'll show you real quickly, a summary here, of those tips is use the report filters, the report filter tips that I talked about earlier when you're doing matching criteria on records that you're going to send notifications for. If you are sending notifications to a lot of different users, try using your own company distribution lists and sending an email notification just to that distribution list, and then your infrastructure and your email systems will handle the rest, and they'll get that notice out to all the people that need to get it. And then finally, there are two kinds of notifications. There are user-based notifications, then there's open notifications. Open notifications don't require permission checks. And again, that sometimes is a great way to kind of speed up the delivery of notifications and make them run faster in your application. Here's again a screen where if I was building a notification and I wanted to add additional criteria to say only send this notification when a task is added and certain conditions are true after that task is added, this is where I would start to layer in those filters. And again, I simply want to use that logic of eliminate the most records first, scalar data versus derived data, and work my way down the list that way. So we've talked about speed in the context of building great permissions, custom permissions, and how important they are, that those permissions are built efficiently. We've talked about filters, searches, and APIs, and we've talked about dashboards and notifications. Really, a lot of this does boil down to how you're doing your filtering in your reports and in your searches and in your the reports that are on your dashboards, etc. So I think if you take those tips to heart, I think you will find you're actually able to tune those applications very, very, very well. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about scale. And in this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about how big is big, how complicated is complicated, how QuickBase scales, and how app builders scale their scale within QuickBase. So a couple of quick questions. What does complex look like in QuickBase? What do you think the most fields ever in a table is? So how many fields do you think is the most we've ever had? 16,389, which is a gigantic table. That is huge, right? But we can handle it, which is the great news. How many, what do you think the number of the most tables in any given app has ever been? 339 tables, very big app. But we can handle it, which is great. The most records in an app, any idea? 36 million. Again, QuickBase is scalable for sure. How does QuickBase scale? Just a little bit of insight, and there's more that you can learn in some of the other sessions here at this year's Empower about how QuickBase is built and how QuickBase helps software developers actually get the most out of a platform like ours. But in summary, QuickBase scales essentially by having a series of machines that we host ourselves in our own data centers. Those bare metal machines have a series of core engines, replicated QuickBase core engines inside of them, where anytime anybody wants to use an application, it's loaded through into the system. It hits an app load balancer, which looks for the next available core engine that we can load those apps into. And then that's where your app is served up for the duration of your sessions. When you're done, we put your app back into storage and free up that space for more apps to use on those core engines. And we can scale this model infinitely by simply adding more machines that have more core engines to serve more customers and more applications. When it comes to the builders, the app builders, how do you build scalable apps? There's really two ways to think about building apps in QuickBase. One is super scalable and the other isn't so much. We recommend not going for monolithic apps that serve many workflows, serve many audiences, and have a tremendous amount of data, historical, etc. We think more in terms of building horizontal scale, smaller apps that can replicate data between themselves, where all the users have the right information that they need to do the right job at any given moment, and that you're thinking the same way that we are in terms of replicating applications and having purpose-built solutions that can talk to each other as necessary. A couple of other tips to think about when it comes to building scalable applications. We have features called cross-app relationships that let you show data from one app to another app. We encourage you to think about, do you really need that live cross-app relationship to have that data perfectly in sync every second of every day? Maybe you don't. Maybe that data never really changes, or if it does, it changes on a predictable schedule, in which case, maybe you could just replicate that data using a different technique without necessarily using cross-app relationships. Do you need all of that data in there all of the time? A lot of people we find just kind of leave all the data they've ever had in this app in there forever. And they say, well, it's at least here if I wanted to report on it. There are times, however, when it might be better to just move that historical data out to a separate application to do your reporting on and leave your operational data in the apps that most of your users are using on a regular basis. And there's ways to share that data between those apps and make it super efficient. And lastly, I'll just point you to QuickBase University, where we have some best practices, a whole best practices section where we have specific articles and courses designed to teach you how to share data between your applications in the most efficient and effective way possible. So again, in review, scale, QuickBase can be very, very, very complex. We can have a tremendous amount of data in your applications. It can perform and scale very, very well. QuickBase itself, the platform, can scale infinitely. And we just encourage our app builders to think similarly and try not to build gigantic monolithic apps that serve every purpose possible, and think more about scaling horizontally with smaller purpose-built apps that talk well to each other. And that's really the whole session here. Again, we gave you a little bit about the basics of QuickBase, some tips to get the most speed out of your QuickBase applications, and a little bit of information about how to scale those applications. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great Empower. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.